What can names tell us about eyewitness material in the Gospel of Mark? That's the big question, and I'm your host, Gabriel Bouch. In our last video, we observed that the pattern of names appearing in the Gospels and Acts, specifically the frequency with which different names appear and when those names are disambiguated and when they are not disambiguated, strongly suggests that the material in the Gospels is based on real people and real events. In this video, we're going to look at one more feature related to names in the Gospels. Now, as we might expect, there are named as well as unnamed characters in the Gospels. And generally speaking, it's not difficult to understand why some characters are named and why others are unnamed. Richard Bauckham explains the general pattern. Public persons, that is, those who would have been known apart from the story of Jesus, John the Baptist, Herod, Herodias, Caiaphas, Pilate, presumably Barabbas, are usually named. The beneficiaries and stories of Jesus' healings and exorcisms are usually unnamed. Persons who encounter Jesus on one occasion and do not become disciples are usually unnamed. Some of the unnamed persons are so insignificant in the narratives that we would not normally expect them to be named. Disciples of Jesus, including the 12, are usually named. These categories are readily intelligible. One would expect that the names of the disciples of Jesus would be remembered in the traditions, and that public persons would also appear by name, while the names of people who were healed or encountered Jesus on one occasion might not even have been known to those who first told the stories and would not seem to present any good reason for being remembered. Because this pattern generally holds throughout the Gospels, it is interesting to note those cases in which the pattern is broken. For example, Mark almost never names people who are healed by Jesus or closely associated with those healed by Jesus. But on two occasions, he does. Why? Why does Mark name Jairus and Bartimaeus, but none of the other people who are healed by Jesus? Well, we get a very strong clue near the end of Mark's gospel. Let me give you the context. The Gospel of Mark begins with the ministry of John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was a really well-known public figure, not just inside of Palestine, but also outside of Palestine. In fact, the first century Jewish historian Josephus writes about the ministry of John the Baptist. Now, after describing John's ministry and imprisonment, the next thing that Mark tells us in his narrative is that Jesus chose some people to be his disciples. This occurs very early in his gospel, just 16 verses into chapter 1. And for the next 13 chapters, these disciples are never away from Jesus. They are present to witness everything that Jesus does in his ministry. This doesn't change until halfway through chapter 14. There, a significant event occurs, and the disciples begin to disappear from the narrative. Here's what we read. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. The only disciple whom Mark specifically mentions staying nearby is Peter, who follows Jesus from a distance until he's accused of being associated with Jesus. Now, by the end of chapter 14, Peter completely disappears from the narrative. This is significant because, as we'll discuss in a future video, there is strong historical evidence that Peter was Mark's primary source of material about Jesus' life and ministry. So when we get to chapter 15 and 16, which describe Jesus' crucifixion, his burial, and the discovery of the empty tomb, all of the primary eyewitnesses have disappeared from the narrative. Now, it's precisely here that Mark provides us with the greatest number of named individuals outside of the 12 apostles. Relatively speaking, chapter 15 and 16 are packed full of names. Here are the key passages. Chapter 15, verse 21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Verse 40. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Verses 42 through 47. It was preparation day. that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. In one chapter, we are introduced to Simon of Cyrene, his sons Alexander and Rufus, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, Salome, and Joseph of Arimathea. Why? Why does Mark introduce all these named individuals? Well, the most plausible explanation is that these individuals were eyewitnesses of these events in the Christian community and continued to talk about these events years after they had taken place. Now, we've already observed that all the primary witnesses, Peter and the other disciples, have disappeared from the narrative. Further, Jewish teaching indicated that it was important to have multiple eyewitnesses to important claims. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, we read this: "One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." Now, by the first century, this principle was applied much more broadly. Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and the discovery of the empty tomb were the foundational events of the Christian faith. And Mark knew it was important to supply eyewitnesses to these events. And so he is very careful to do that for each of these 3 key moments. Let's look again. First, the crucifixion. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. Now notice, although a number of women are present, Mark is very careful to make sure that he names at least 3 of them. Next is the burial. Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. Once again, Mark is naming 3 eyewitnesses. Then the discovery of the empty tomb. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early in the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. Once again, 3 named witnesses. Now, maybe we think, well, this is just a coincidence. Mark just decided to throw in a few names here. Well, it's very clear that he expects us to see these as eyewitnesses because of the language he uses. In the ancient world, being an eyewitness was associated with sight. And Mark uses all kinds of verbs associated with sight all throughout these passages. Let's look one more time. Some women were watching from a distance. Verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. Chapter 16, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Mark is making it very clear that these individuals were eyewitnesses to these events. He doesn't add names to his narrative to just spice things up a little bit. He's supplying the names of individuals who served as eyewitnesses in the Christian community and who continued to talk about these events years after they had taken place. Eyewitness testimony was extremely valuable to the Christians in the first century, and Mark wants us to know his sources. The presence of named eyewitnesses in the Gospel of Mark and elsewhere strongly suggests that we can get very reliable information about Jesus in our 4 canonical Gospels. Now, if you found this video helpful, will you leave a comment or like or subscribe? I look forward to seeing you in future videos.